Hi, I'm Simon Shuster, the Berlin correspondent for Time magazine, and you're listening to Transit Lounge Radio in Berlin at the 15th Disruption Network Lab event, Dark Havens Confronting Hidden Money and Power.
Hi, Simon. Thank you so much for joining me in the Transit Lounge. It's really a pleasure to have you here. So I'm really curious, I guess, to know a little bit about your role in confronting hidden money and power and how you came to be involved in the Dark Havens conference.
Well, I've been reporting on these subjects for quite a while. Before Berlin, I was the Moscow correspondent for Time magazine, and that brought me into a lot of stories related to the use of offshore tax havens for all kinds of illicit purposes, corruption networks, smuggling networks, organized crime, and government corruption. And in Europe, I've sort of continued to report around those themes. That's probably why Dark Havens reached out to me and the Disruption Network Lab to help moderate the event. I think a lot of the stories, pretty much all the stories that I work on now, have a component of tax havens and offshore wealth, regardless of whether it's politics, business, or organized crime. They all contain elements of the use of offshore tax havens. That's really just the circulatory system of the money that flows through in between all of these systems. So it touches on basically every story that I work on.
I know, it's super fascinating. I think when I was speaking to Frederick Obermeyer, and he sort of said, 10 years ago, you mentioned tax at a party and people would run screaming. But I think the conversation and the public understanding of how these offshore tax havens work and also how much they're impacting our day-to-day lives in society, like in terms of, money being extracted from the economy and circulating in a different kind of, I don't know if it's a shadow economy, a dark economy, what sort of, how you describe it, but that there are also very real world effects in terms of the way that we're living and the way that governments function, that it's sort of so bound up in this other system.
Yeah, and the awareness, the public awareness is really growing, and the interest is really intensifying. This year at the Davos Forum, the Davos Summit, Time magazine hosted a panel discussion on taxes. And one of the speakers there is Professor Bergman, a Dutch professor. He's a historian, but he specializes in taxes.
He's an absolute hero. I've just finished reading Utopia for Realists, and fantastic. So you hosted him there. That's awesome.
Yeah, and he made a remark about the hypocrisy of some billionaires traveling to Davos on private jets and talking about saving the world. And he made the point that, we need to be talking about taxes. And the video of him making that remark went absolutely viral. And it was interesting to me because it was a point that's often made by journalists, experts, even politicians. But somehow the way he phrased it, and maybe the moment in which he phrased it, allowed it to really, start a conversation globally. And that was really exciting and nice also for the editors of Time that they could be part of this conversation, help spark it. But what it really showed me is that the interest among the public is intense. Social media users all over the world spreading and commenting on this point that he made, and he's since given a lot of really interesting talks, and you mentioned his book. So I think you're right that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it would have been hard for a remark on taxes and hypocrisy to really spread like that.
And I mean, how do you think that it's possible to actually make that shift so that people who have so much consolidated wealth and power and who are so kind of involved in the systems of government and these like transnational corporations that are kind of pulling the strings a lot behind the scenes, what do you think it takes to actually shift the way that they're operating to make the people with that super concentrated wealth understand that maybe it's not such a great thing to keep it all to themselves and that actually feeding it back into society could be beneficial for everyone?
Well, as we discussed at the Dark Havens Forum here in Berlin, it takes a lot of public pressure on the politicians to raise this issue on the agenda of politicians as they run for office and as they govern and make policy. That kind of pressure has to come from the bottom and has to be part of the conversation about inequality. I think that's where the interest is coming from. People understand that taxes and offshore wealth, are central to the issue of inequality, the stratification of wealth, these ultra high net worth individuals essentially playing by rules that don't apply to the rest of us and ignoring rules and laws that do apply to the rest of us when it comes to taxes, certainly skirting those rules. But to be honest, having covered this for some years, I'm a bit pessimistic about the impact that can really have. After the global financial crisis, and as the global financial crisis was unfolding, President Obama, made this a central part of his campaign in 2008 when he was being elected. He talked a lot about tax havens. When he took office, his government, his administration made this a big priority. They passed legislation that was quite powerful. I think so. The most powerful, if you look at a law like FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, it was groundbreaking and unprecedented in its scope. Still, it has not destroyed that system. So I do think the Obama administration made an honest attempt under the pressure that was bubbling up from the global financial crisis and the anger among the public and voters related to that crisis. But still, it did not unravel that system. The system continued to exist. The main takeaway from my reporting on it is that it became more difficult for kind of mid-level millionaires to use the system of tax avoidance built into offshore tax havens. But the billionaires and the multimillionaires still had access to this through loopholes and complex tax avoidance schemes that they could get through more expensive lawyers. But the lower level lower level millionaires found it somewhat more difficult, or I'd say a lot more difficult, to access that system. But it didn't destroy the system.
Yeah, clearly it's still operating like I hear the figures somewhere between $7 trillion and $40 trillion that's still sitting in offshore accounts. And I mean, Nicholas Jackson was talking a little bit about working with the Tax Justice Network and, also trying to put pressure on governance. And I hadn't understood that Britain itself is actually responsible for like 50% of the world's tax havens. They're not all in the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really, the essential problem. In our discussions here, Switzerland really took it on the chin. A lot of people were focusing on Switzerland. The Obama administration was focusing on Switzerland as the oldest and one of the biggest, certainly, tax havens. But the problem with that is that a lot of the countries, the United States and the UK, who have politically made a lot of noise around coming down hard on tax havens and cracking down on them and on tax avoiders, they also, the United States, the UK, France, control a lot of tax havens. I mean, the state of Delaware in the United States is a massive one. The crown dependencies of the UK, Jersey, Guernsey, BVI, I mean, they maintain their position and maybe even increase their position as the leading tax havens in the world as pressure came down on Switzerland and some others. Also, you saw a lot of money moving to Asian tax havens. Singapore, Hong Kong. So it turns into a game of whack-a-mole where as some governments and some legislation begins to put pressure on a certain type of tax avoidance or a certain tax haven, others benefit because the money just flows out to the jurisdictions that can provide the secrecy and can provide the other tax avoidance instruments that the super rich want and need.
And I mean, the secrecy seems to be a really key point as well, because I spoke also with Stephanie Gibault, who was the whistleblower from UBS and who's written a book about how whistleblowers are treated around the world, and the fact that the people who are actually bringing to light these schemes and like at a very high level, they're the ones who are being treated as criminals and who are being, harassed, threatened, imprisoned. I know that there are sort of support networks for whistleblowers, but do you think they're having any effect, or do you think that it's still like very, very difficult for people to come forward when they're aware of these things that are happening and they are in a position to give evidence about it?
In this, I think journalists can play a big role in terms of, providing anonymity and ensuring the anonymity and protecting their sources when whistleblowers do come forward and choose to remain anonymous. That's in many ways up to journalists to protect those sources. But in terms of the whistleblowers who come forward and are either exposed by their employers or the structures where they work, or they choose to go public and reveal their names and faces, it's still extremely difficult. I mean, I find it hard to imagine the kind of career trajectory of a whistleblower after they blow the whistle and often said that you can only blow the whistle once, because once you do, these kinds of structures and organizations might not be so keen to let you back in and have a look at their secrets.
So do you have any reflections or things that you kind of learnt or were particularly interesting from the conference on the weekend?
Yeah, it relates to the point I just made about what journalists can do to protect sources. I mean, the big dilemma of the first contact. How do you help a source or a potential source contact you initially without exposing herself or himself to either the investigators within their own institution or maybe some government scrutiny? It's a tricky one because, that first contact, if it's made via email or some other vulnerable form of communication, it really exposes the sources. The conversation that was most useful to me was the one from colleagues at OCCRP and The Intercept about how to deal with that. How do you build infrastructure? And in many ways, this is a technical issue. How do you create the kinds of anonymous drop boxes, and how do you inform potential sources about how to use those safely so that they maintain anonymity if they choose to blow the whistle without exposing themselves?
I think, Friedrich made a nice comment where he said he had someone write from their government email address, and he said, never contact a journalist again, ever. But there are things also, I guess, of informing people, like how to use Secure Drop or some of the other systems that are actually available to start giving information anonymously and securely without it being monitored, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. These technologies are available. They're developing. Another really exciting thing that was discussed here for me as a journalist was something that OCCRP is doing, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. They're creating a sort of database of databases of leaks where journalists can more easily go back and search through databases and files that have been leaked in the past. And that's really exciting and would be potentially game-changing for journalists, because often when a leak comes out, even one as big as the Panama Papers or Edward Snowden's revelations, there's a certain wave of interest and reporting around it. But after, a few days or weeks or months, the interest fades. But often the bulk of the information that has been leaked, the bulk of the files, have not yet even been read or studied and have not resulted in journalistic reports. So what a database of these leaks would do is allow journalists to essentially, when they begin working on a story, go onto that database and look for files related to the subject of their latest report and see if there's material there that can deepen their understanding of the subject matter, files that maybe have gone unnoticed from previous leaks. So the fact that some of the most talented people in the game right now are working on that kind of database of databases is really exciting.
No, that's absolutely fascinating. It can be hard to get editors to agree to more stories on tax havens, corruption. So if you can actually work on embedding it into a story with a different angle, or that's, bringing something else to light in terms of injustice or inequality or malfeasance in general, then that's giving you just another way of reporting. So I'm just wondering too, as a sort of a journalist working in this field, what sort of risks have you taken? And do you feel comfortable talking about the sort of, the personal aspect of that, and if that's affected you at all in terms of reporting on, hidden power structures or, beneficiaries of these enormous resources?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. One point that I highlighted is that some of the most dangerous work outside of a immediate hot war zone that journalists can do is exposing the way that illegal money is made. So exposing the beneficiaries behind shell companies that are used for illicit purposes. When you do that, you really create an incentive for the people behind these structures to go after you personally and physically, because it's a lot cheaper for them to really hire a hitman to take you out. This does happen. That has happened.
Yeah, no, I understand. Like in Russia, there's a very big problem with journalist safety, and also Turkey, and of course, as we've seen in Malta.
Yeah, exactly. And when someone who is engaged in organized crime, corruption, arms smuggling, drug smuggling, when their names or their connection to some of these shell companies is exposed, the shell companies involved in these illegal schemes, they start to look at their options, right? And those options can be quite scary for journalists. So yeah, that has happened to me in the past, related to an investigation I did a lifetime ago, maybe 2010 or so, about an arms smuggling ring based out of Kazakhstan. And that report led to scrutiny from the United Nations And the people involved in it were not happy and did try to come after me personally.
How are you still here?
Dumb luck. I happened not to be at the office when these guys came looking for me. And my colleagues were at the office, and they informed me about it, and then we informed the editors, and the editors essentially got me out of country to sit it out. And then, I had to change quite a bit about where I worked and how I worked for a while until things blew over.
And then once a story comes out and it's in the public eye, then there's not so much impetus to try to silence the journalist, I imagine.
I think that's right, yeah. I mean, in this case, this happened after the story actually came out. So there seemed to be, maybe they were afraid of a follow-up report, or maybe it was motivated more by revenge. But it's not always the case that once the story's out, you're safe. But I think there is some truth to that. If the subject of an investigation gets the sense that they can stop the investigation by silencing the journalist, I think they have more motivation to do that. There's some recent cases, you mentioned the one in Malta, show that when a journalist is attacked or even killed, their colleagues now make a point to continue the investigation, to finish the work that she or he started, to make sure that motivation for the criminals doesn't exist. So they do not feel that they can stop an investigation by silencing a journalist. Indeed.
I think that's a good thing. We don't want people to feel like they can gain impunity through like violence and intimidation. And I mean, do you think that regular people have sort of agency in trying to affect change in terms of somehow rewriting the narratives that we have, or that we are telling stories about, taking the stories from journalists and actually going further with those, agitating? Yeah, I mean, what sort of actions or, strategies do you think could be effective?
Oh, I think there is some synergy between the work that journalists do and what activists and NGOs do. When a report, something like the Panama Papers happens, the journalists do the work of vetting the documents and publishing the stories and getting the information out. But then it's really up to civil society to push for change. Journalists don't generally stand out on the street with placards, saying close the tax havens. That's up to activists. And I think that does have an impact. I mean, politicians do pay attention to these things, at least in democratic countries. And I think that's where the change will probably come from. It'll be not from top down, because unfortunately political structures and politicians, even in democratic countries, are under intense economic and political pressure to not close tax havens and loopholes. If there's enough pressure from the grassroots level and from civil society, then I think it can change.
I'm glad to hear that. And my last question is, what's your vision for the future, or your hope for the future?
As relates to tax havens?
Do you have any final reflections or thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think a final reflection would be one thing that's come out of this forum that we had this week is the importance of the work that journalists do. There's a lot of criticism of journalists coming from political leaders in the U.S. and around Europe and really worldwide. Media literacy, to the extent that people understand the work that journalists do, the value that it brings, kind of its function as, in many ways, the immune system of a society in trying to, expose things that I think most people would agree we do not want in our societies. Organized crime, corruption, illicit wealth, inequality. It is the job of journalists to expose these things and to bring public attention to them. I would hope that, and I do see that happening as a strange reaction or backlash to the attacks against journalists. More and more people are becoming aware of the importance of the work that journalists do. I mean, you see that, for example, in the subscription rates of the New York Times, and more broadly in conversations that I have, that people are aware that, journalists do important stuff. I think it's important for people to understand and to hear what we do, to understand the kinds of conversations and the complexity of the work that goes into dealing with a leak, dealing with a story. So I think it's important to get the word out about that, and I thank you for your role in helping us do that.
I'm very happy to help do that. And I mean, I think keeping people in power accountable to the societies that they're actually meant to be serving is really a really key aspect of journalism. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining me and for all your great work.
Thank you.